The morning sun cast long shadows across the abandoned military training facility as Elena Vasquez methodically cleaned her rifle. Each movement was precise, practiced, almost meditative. The Barrett M82A1 lay disassembled before her on the weathered wooden table, its components gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights of the makeshift workshop she had claimed as her own. Elena had been coming to this forgotten corner of the base for 3 months now, ever since her deployment to the remote outpost in Afghanistan. While other soldiers spent their downtime playing cards, writing letters home, or catching up on sleep, she found solace in the ritual of weapon maintenance. It wasn't just about keeping her equipment in perfect condition, though that was certainly important. It was about the quiet, the focus, the way her mind could empty itself of everything except the task at hand. She picked up the bolt assembly, examining it under the light. Not a speck of dust or residue remained. Her fingers moved with the confidence of someone who had performed this routine thousands of times before. Elena had been shooting since she was 8 years old, taught by her grandfather who had served in Vietnam. He had recognized something in her even then. A natural stillness that most people spent years trying to achieve. The sound of boots on gravel outside caught her attention, but she didn't look up. Privacy was a rare commodity on a military base, but this particular building had been condemned for structural issues months ago. Most people avoided it entirely, which suited Elena perfectly. She continued her work, carefully applying a thin layer of lubricant to the bolt. The footsteps stopped just outside the door. Elena's hands never paused in their work, but her senses sharpened. Years of training and deployment had taught her to be aware of her surroundings without appearing alert. She heard the soft scrape of a boot against the doorframe, the subtle shift in the air that indicated someone was watching her. "You know that building's off limits, right?" The voice was male, confident, with just a hint of an accent she couldn't immediately place. Elena looked up for the first time, her dark eyes meeting those of a tall, lean man in desert camouflage. His uniform bore the insignia of a staff sergeant, though she didn't recognize him from her unit. He had the kind of weathered face that spoke of multiple deployments, with laugh lines around his eyes that suggested he found humor even in difficult situations. "So is unauthorized observation of military personnel," she replied coolly, returning her attention to her rifle. "Yet, here we both are." The man stepped into the room, his movements easy and relaxed, despite the fact that he was technically breaking the same rules she was. "Fair enough. I'm Marcus Chen, 3rd Battalion, just transferred in yesterday." He gestured toward her rifle. "That's some serious hardware. You know your way around it?" Elena's lips curved in what might have been a smile, though there was no humor in it. "I've managed to figure out which end the bullets come out of," Marcus laughed, a genuine sound that seemed to fill the small space. "I'll bet you have. Mind if I ask what your longest confirmed kill is?" The question hung in the air between them. It was the kind of question soldiers asked each other, a way of measuring skill and experience. But there was something different about the way Marcus asked it, an intensity that suggested this wasn't casual conversation. Elena reassembled the bolt with swift, precise movements before answering. 2,400 meters. Helmand Province, 18 months ago. She didn't elaborate, didn't mention the Taliban commander who had been coordinating attacks on supply convoys, or the 3-day hunt through the mountains that had preceded the shot. Marcus whistled low. "That's impressive. Long-range stuff requires a special kind of patience." He moved closer to the table, studying her rifle with the eye of someone who knew quality when he saw it. "What's your effective range with that setup?" "Depends on conditions. Wind, temperature, humidity, target movement." Elena slid the bolt back into the receiver with a satisfying click. "Under ideal circumstances, maybe 3,000 meters. In the field, I keep it conservative." "Conservative." Marcus repeated the word as if testing its flavor. "What would you say if I told you I've seen shots made at distances that would make your Helmand kill look like close quarters work?" Elena's hands stilled for just a moment before continuing their methodical reassembly. "I'd say you've either seen some remarkable shooting or you've been listening to too many bar stories. What if I told you I've made those shots myself?" This time Elena did stop what she was doing. She turned to face Marcus fully, studying his face for signs of the bravado that often accompanied military tall tales. What she saw instead was quiet confidence, the kind that came from actual experience rather than wishful thinking. "I'd ask you to prove it," Marcus smiled, but it wasn't the cocky grin she had expected. Instead, it was the expression of someone who had been hoping to hear exactly those words. "As it happens, I was hoping you might say that." He reached into his cargo pocket and pulled out a small device that looked like a modified rangefinder. "This measures distance with laser precision. I've been watching you work for the past few days, and I have a proposition." Elena felt a chill run down her spine. Though whether it was excitement or apprehension, she couldn't say. "What kind of proposition?" "What?" "There's a rock formation about 4 kilometers northeast of here. Big boulder, maybe 8 feet across, sitting alone on a hillside. Impossible to miss with the naked eye. But at that distance, through a scope, it becomes a very different challenge. 4 kilometers. Elena did the math in her head. 4,000 meters was well beyond the effective range of most sniper rifles, including her own. Even with perfect conditions, wind drift alone would make that shot nearly impossible. "Nearly impossible," Marcus agreed. "But not actually impossible. Not for someone with the right skill set." Elena studied his face again, looking for any hint that this was some kind of joke or test. All she saw was serious intent. "You're talking about a shot that would require perfect environmental conditions. A rifle capable of maintaining accuracy at extreme range, and a level of skill that maybe a dozen people in the world possess. I'm talking about a shot that I made last week." The words hung in the air between them like a challenge. Elena felt her pulse quicken despite her outward calm. She had always prided herself on being one of the best marksmen in her unit, possibly in her entire battalion. The idea that someone could make a shot at such an extreme distance was both thrilling and deeply unsettling. "What's your point?" she asked finally. Marcus gestured toward her rifle. "My point is that you're cleaning that weapon like it's the most important thing in your world, which tells me you understand the relationship between a shooter and their equipment. You've made a hell of a shot at 2,400 meters, which tells me you have the skill and patience for long-range work. And you didn't immediately dismiss what I'm telling you as impossible, which tells me you have the kind of open mind that separates good shooters from great ones." Elena finished reassembling her rifle, the familiar weight of the weapon somehow comforting in her hands. "You still haven't told me what your proposition is." "Simple. Come with me to that rock formation. Let me show you the shooting position I used. If you think you can make the shot, you're welcome to try." Marcus paused, his expression becoming more serious. "But I should warn you, what I'm talking about isn't just about marksmanship. At that range, you're dealing with physics that most shooters never encounter. Bullet drop, wind drift, even the rotation of the earth becomes a factor." "Coriolis effect," Elena said automatically. "At 4,000 meters, with a typical bullet velocity, you'd need to adjust for the Earth's rotation, or you'd miss by several inches, even with a perfect aim." Marcus's eyebrows rose slightly. "You've done the calculations." "I've done the calculations for every major physics factor that affects long-range shooting," Elena replied. "It's one thing to understand the theory. It's another thing entirely to execute the shot." "Exactly." Marcus moved to the window, gazing out at the mountains that surrounded their base. Most shooters plateau at around 2,000 meters. They can make shots at that distance consistently, and they convince themselves that's the limit of what's possible. But the real challenge, the real art, begins beyond that point. Elena joined him at the window, following his gaze toward the northeast. Somewhere out there, beyond the rolling hills and scattered vegetation, was the target he was describing. 4,800 meters, nearly 3 miles. The distance seemed impossible, almost abstract. "Why me?" she asked. "If you can make this shot, why do you need someone else to attempt it?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried a weight that hadn't been there before. "Because making an impossible shot once could be luck. Having someone else duplicate it proves that it's technique, not chance. And because, he turned to meet her eyes, I think you might be the only person on this base capable of understanding what I'm really trying to accomplish. Elena felt a familiar stirring in her chest, the same feeling she had experienced before every significant challenge in her life. It was part anticipation, part fear, and entirely compelling. She had spent her entire military career pushing the boundaries of what was considered possible in marksmanship, always seeking the next level of precision, the next impossible target. When? She asked simply. Marcus smiled, and this time there was genuine warmth in the expression. Tomorrow morning. Oh, 500 hours. The wind patterns are most predictable at dawn, and the temperature differential gives us the best atmospheric conditions for long-range shooting. Elena nodded, already running calculations in her head. She would need to study weather reports, check her ammunition supply, possibly make some adjustments to her rifle scope. The Barrett M82A1 was an exceptional weapon, but optimizing it for a shot at this distance would require careful consideration of every variable. One more thing, Marcus added as he turned to leave. Don't mention this to anyone else. What we're attempting isn't exactly standard training protocol, and there are people who might not understand the scientific value of what we're doing. After he left, Elena stood alone in the abandoned building, her rifle cradled in her arms. 4,800 meters. The number seemed to echo in her mind like a mantra. She had dreamed of making shots at such extreme ranges, had studied the ballistics and environmental factors involved, but she had never imagined the opportunity would actually present itself. She spent the rest of the afternoon in preparation. Weather reports indicated clear skies and minimal wind for the next morning. Ideal conditions for long-range shooting. She inspected every round of 50 BMG ammunition she owned, selecting only those with the most consistent powder charges and bullet weights. Small variations in ammunition could mean the difference between a hit and a miss at such extreme range. As the sun began to set, Elena found herself thinking about her grandfather. He had been a sniper in Vietnam, and though he rarely spoke about his experiences in detail, he had passed on to her a deep understanding of the patience and precision required for long-range shooting. More than that, he had taught her to see shooting not just as a military skill, but as a form of applied physics. A complex equation where human skill met environmental variables. It's not about the gun, he had told her when she was 12, teaching her to shoot his old hunting rifle at the range behind his house in rural Texas. The gun is just a tool. It's about understanding everything between you and the target. The wind, the temperature, the humidity, even the way the light falls. Most people see an empty space. A real shooter sees a complex environment filled with invisible forces. Now, facing the most challenging shot of her career, Elena found herself returning to those early lessons. 4,800 meters meant dealing with bullet drop measured in dozens of feet, wind drift that could push a bullet several yards off course, and flight time long enough for multiple environmental factors to change during the bullet's journey to the target. She spent the evening cleaning her rifle again, this time with even more attention to detail than usual. Every surface was polished, every moving part lubricated with precision. She adjusted her scope, checking and rechecking the calibration. The Leupold Mark IV was one of the finest sniper scopes ever made. But at the distance she was attempting, even the slightest imperfection in alignment could result in a miss measured in meters rather than inches. Sleep came fitfully that night. Elena found herself alternating between excitement and doubt, her mind constantly running through the calculations required for such an extreme shot. When her alarm sounded at 4:30 in the morning, she was already awake, staring at the ceiling and visualizing the shot sequence she would need to execute in just a few hours. The pre-dawn air was crisp and still as she made her way across the base toward the designated meeting point. Marcus was already there, a substantial rifle case at his feet, and what appeared to be professional meteorological equipment spread across the hood of a military Humvee. "Sleep well?" he asked with a grin. "Like a baby," Elena replied, though they both knew she was lying. Marcus gestured toward his equipment. "I've been monitoring conditions since 3 a.m. Wind is holding steady at 2 to 3 miles per hour from the southeast. Temperature is 62 degrees, and climbing slowly. Humidity is low, barometric pressure is stable. Conditions are about as good as we could hope for. Elena nodded, impressed despite herself by the thoroughness of his preparation. This wasn't the approach of someone making wild claims about impossible shots. This was the methodical planning of a serious long-range shooter. They loaded their equipment into the Humvee and drove northeast, following dirt roads that traced the perimeter of the training area. The landscape was typical of the Afghan highlands, rocky and sparse, with low vegetation that wouldn't interfere with their line of sight. As they drove, Marcus explained the specific location he had chosen for the shooting position. There's a natural depression about 4 clicks from the target, oriented perfectly for a northeast shot. The elevation gives us a slight downward angle, which helps with bullet trajectory, and there's solid rock for a stable shooting platform. More importantly, the surrounding terrain creates a microclimate that reduces wind turbulence. 20 minutes later, they arrived at what appeared to be nothing more than a collection of boulders scattered across a hillside. But as they climbed toward Marcus's chosen position, Elena began to understand his selection. The rocks formed a natural windbreak, and the depression he had mentioned provided excellent concealment while offering an unobstructed view of the target area. Marcus unpacked his rifle first, and Elena felt her breath catch. The weapon was unlike anything she had ever seen in military service. It appeared to be a custom-built precision rifle, possibly based on a Shaytak M200 platform, but modified with components she didn't immediately recognize. "What exactly am I looking at?" she asked. "Custom build," Marcus replied, his voice carrying the pride of someone discussing a deeply personal creation. Shaytak receiver, Krieger barrel, Macmillan stock, Schmidt and Bender scope, everything hand-selected and fitted for maximum accuracy at extreme range. Elena examined the rifle more closely. The barrel was longer than anything she had used before, designed to extract maximum velocity from each shot. The scope was a work of art, with adjustment turrets precise enough to make corrections measured in fractions of minutes of angle. Most impressive was the muzzle brake, a complex piece of engineering designed to minimize barrel movement during firing. "How much does it weigh?" she asked. 32 pounds, fully loaded. Marcus began setting up a sophisticated bipod system. At the distances we're shooting, every ounce of stability matters. While Marcus prepared his equipment, Elena used her binoculars to scan the target area, 4,800 meters away. Barely visible even through high-quality optics, she could make out the boulder he had described. It looked impossibly small, a tiny dark spot against the lighter-colored hillside. "There," Marcus said, joining her and pointing northeast. "See it?" Elena adjusted her binoculars, bringing the distant target into focus. The boulder was larger than she had initially thought, perhaps 8 feet across as he had claimed. But at this distance, it still appeared no larger than a pebble. Through her rifle scope, it would fill only a small portion of the reticle. "I see it," she said. "Now explain to me how anyone makes a shot at that distance." Marcus smiled and began unpacking what appeared to be a small computer. "Ballistic calculator," he explained, connecting it to a weather station that he had set up nearby. "At this range, we can't rely on instinct or traditional holdovers. Every shot has to be calculated precisely." For the next hour, Marcus walked Elena through the complex mathematics of extreme long-range shooting: bullet velocity, ballistic coefficient, atmospheric pressure, temperature, humidity, wind speed, and direction at multiple altitudes. Even the target's elevation relative to the shooting position. Each variable was measured, calculated, and input into the ballistic computer. Coriolis effect at this range requires a correction of 4 inches to the left, Marcus explained, pointing to the computer display. Total bullet drop is 137 feet. Wind drift, assuming current conditions hold steady, is 18 inches to the northwest. Elena stared at the numbers, trying to comprehend the magnitude of what she was seeing. 137 feet of bullet drop meant she would need to aim more than 13 stories above her intended target. The wind drift calculation assumed perfectly steady conditions throughout the bullet's entire flight time, which would be approximately 6 seconds from trigger pull to impact. 6 seconds, she said aloud, shaking her head. In 6 seconds, wind conditions could change. The target could move. Atmospheric pressure could shift. Exactly, Marcus agreed. Which is why most people consider this shot impossible. But impossible and extremely difficult aren't the same thing. Elena positioned herself behind Marcus's custom rifle, feeling the weight of the weapon against her shoulder. Through the powerful Schmidt and Bender scope, the distant boulder came into sharp focus, though it still appeared deceptively small against the vast landscape beyond. She had spent the last 30 minutes studying every aspect of the shooting position, from the natural rock rest that would support the rifle's bipod to the wind patterns visible in the vegetation between her position and the target. Breathing rhythm is critical at this distance, Marcus said quietly, settling into a spotting position beside her with his own high-powered scope. Any movement during trigger pull will translate to feet of deviation at the target. Elena nodded, though her attention was focused on the reticle of the scope. The crosshairs were graduated in precise measurements, each mark representing a specific angular distance. According to the ballistic calculations Marcus had shown her, she needed to hold approximately 42 minutes of angle above the target to compensate for bullet drop. The correction seemed impossibly large, requiring her to aim at empty sky far above the boulder. Wind at the target area looked stable, Marcus observed, watching the distant hillside through his spotting scope. No visible movement in the vegetation. But remember, conditions can change during flight time. Elena had been thinking about exactly that problem. 6 seconds was an eternity in the world of precision shooting. Weather patterns that appeared stable through ground observation could shift dramatically at different altitudes, and there was no way to predict with certainty what a bullet would encounter during its long journey through the atmosphere. She settled into the shooting position more comfortably, adjusting her body alignment until the rifle felt like a natural extension of herself. The stock was positioned perfectly against her shoulder. Her trigger hand gripped the rifle with just enough pressure to maintain control without inducing tremor. Her support hand rested lightly under the stock, providing stability without creating tension. Range to target, 4,814 meters. Marcus read from his laser rangefinder. Atmospheric conditions holding steady. Are you ready for the calculations? Elena took a deep breath, clearing her mind of everything except the technical requirements of the shot. Go ahead. Elevation correction, 42.3 minutes of angle up. Windage correction, 1.7 minutes of angle left for Coriolis effect, plus an additional 2.1 minutes left for wind drift. Total flight time, 5.8 seconds. The numbers settled into Elena's mind like pieces of a complex puzzle. She began making the necessary adjustments to the scope's turrets, each click representing a precise, angular change. The elevation adjustment alone required more than 80 clicks of the turret, a correction so large that she had to remind herself she wasn't making an error. Through the scope, her aim point was now positioned far above the visible target, hanging in empty sky that appeared featureless and infinite. Only the mathematical certainty of the ballistic calculations gave her confidence that this extreme holdover would somehow guide her bullet to the intended impact point nearly 3 miles away. Scope is dialed, she announced quietly. Wind holding steady at 3 miles per hour from the southeast. Marcus confirmed. Temperature has risen to 65 degrees, but not enough to significantly affect the trajectory. Elena settled into her final shooting position, focusing on her breathing rhythm. For a shot of this complexity, the timing had to be perfect. She would need to fire during the natural pause between breaths, when her body was most stable and her pulse had the least effect on rifle movement. The crosshairs danced slightly in the scope view, responding to her heartbeat and minor movements that would be imperceptible at normal shooting distances. At 4,800 meters, however, even the slightest tremor would be magnified into significant deviation. She concentrated on achieving the kind of absolute stillness that separated competent shooters from exceptional ones. Ready when you are, Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper. Elena's finger found the trigger, applying just enough pressure to take up the slack without disturbing the rifle's position. The trigger on Marcus's custom rifle was a work of art, breaking cleanly at exactly 2 pounds, with no detectable movement or over-travel. She estimated the pressure required, building toward the break point with infinite patience. The world around her seemed to fade away. The mountain landscape, The early morning sun, even Marcus's presence beside her, became distant and irrelevant. Her entire universe contracted to the small circle of view through the rifle scope, the feeling of the trigger under her finger, and the rhythm of her own breathing. She exhaled slowly, allowing her body to settle into its most relaxed state. At the natural pause between breaths, when her lungs were empty and her pulse was at its calmest point, she applied the final pressure to the trigger. The rifle's report was thunderous, echoing off the surrounding rocks and rolling across the valley like distant thunder. The massive muzzle brake channeled gases upward and to the sides, minimizing muzzle climb but creating a spectacular fireball that momentarily obscured her view through the scope. Elena maintained her position behind the rifle, following through on the shot as she had been trained. Even though the bullet would take nearly 6 seconds to reach its target, proper follow-through was crucial for consistency and accuracy. She kept the crosshairs on her aim point, maintaining sight picture until the recoil impulse had fully dissipated. "Clean break," Marcus said, though his attention was focused on his spotting scope rather than her shooting form. Bullets should be approaching the target, now. In the distance, far beyond their ability to see with the naked eye, Elena's bullet was completing its long arc through the atmosphere, traveling at more than twice the speed of sound when it left the barrel. It had lost significant velocity during its journey but was still moving at nearly 1,500 feet per second as it descended toward the target area. "Impact," Marcus said suddenly, his voice tight with concentration. "I see dust cloud at the target." Elena remained motionless behind the rifle, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. Through the powerful telescope, Marcus would be able to observe the bullet's impact with far more precision than her rifle scope allowed. "Results?" she asked, though her voice was steadier than she felt. Marcus was quiet for several seconds, making careful observations through his spotting scope. When he finally spoke, there was genuine amazement in his voice. "Hit, center mass of the boulder, maybe 6 inches left of your aim point." Elena felt a wave of emotions wash over her that she hadn't expected. Relief, excitement, and something approaching disbelief combined in a rush that left her momentarily speechless. She had made shots at extreme range before, but nothing approaching this distance. The fact that her bullet had even reached the target seemed remarkable enough. The fact that it had impacted within inches of her intended point was beyond her previous conception of what was possible. "Are you certain?" she asked, though she knew Marcus wouldn't make such a claim unless he was absolutely sure. "Positive identification. Your bullet impacted the rock face approximately 6 inches left of center, consistent with a slight underestimation of wind conditions." Marcus lowered his spotting scope and turned to look at her with an expression of genuine respect. That was an exceptional shot. Elena finally lifted her head from the rifle scope, blinking in the bright morning sunlight that seemed harsh after the focused view through the optics. The realization of what she had just accomplished was beginning to sink in, along with an understanding of why Marcus had been so secretive about the entire exercise. "How many people have made confirmed shots at this distance?" she asked. Marcus considered the question carefully. "With proper documentation and verification? Maybe a dozen in the history of modern warfare? Most of those were under ideal conditions with unlimited time for preparation." Elena looked northeast toward the target area, though the boulder was invisible to the naked eye from their current position. 3 miles. The bullet she had fired had traveled nearly 3 miles through variable atmospheric conditions, over terrain that rose and fell unpredictably, in a flight time that spanned almost 6 seconds. The mathematical precision required seemed almost supernatural. "Why?" she asked suddenly, turning to face Marcus directly. "Why was this important to you? What are we really doing out here?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his eyes scanning the horizon as if searching for the right words. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight that suggested this question went to the heart of why he had sought her out in the first place. "Because the conventional wisdom says it can't be done," he said finally. "Every military manual, every training program, every expert opinion establishes effective limits for sniper engagement. Most sources put maximum effective range at around 2,000 meters. Maybe 2,500 under perfect conditions." Elena nodded. She had read the same manuals, participated in the same training programs. The ranges she had just shot were so far beyond accepted doctrine that they entered the realm of theoretical possibility rather than practical application. But theory and practice aren't always the same thing, Marcus continued. With the right equipment, the right calculations, and the right shooter, those limits become suggestions rather than absolute barriers. Elena began to understand the larger implications of what they were exploring. Military doctrine was built around proven capabilities, tested under battlefield conditions, and verified through extensive training. But doctrine was also conservative by nature, establishing reliable baselines rather than pushing the absolute boundaries of what was possible. "You're talking about changing the way people think about long-range engagement," she said. "I'm talking about proving that the limits we accept might be artificially low," Marcus replied. "Your shot just demonstrated that a skilled shooter with proper equipment can engage targets at distances that current doctrine considers impossible." Elena thought about the tactical implications of such capability. A sniper able to engage targets at distances approaching 5 kilometers would be operating from positions so remote that return fire would be virtually impossible. Traditional counter-sniper tactics relied on identifying muzzle flash, sound signature, or other indicators that became much more difficult to detect across such extreme ranges. This isn't just about marksmanship, she realized. It's about fundamentally changing battlefield dynamics. Marcus smiled, but there was a serious edge to his expression. "Now you're beginning to understand why I couldn't discuss this through official channels. What we're exploring has implications that go far beyond individual shooting skill." Elena picked up her own rifle, feeling its familiar weight in her hands. The Barrett M82A1 was an exceptional weapon, but compared to Marcus's custom build, it represented conventional thinking about what a sniper rifle should be. Marcus's weapon was designed specifically to push beyond conventional limits, built without regard for traditional constraints of weight, complexity, or cost. "How long have you been working on this?" she asked. 3 years of research, 2 years of equipment development, 18 months of field testing. Marcus began carefully packing his ballistic computer and weather monitoring equipment. "You're the first person I've found who could successfully execute a shot at this range." Elena felt a mixture of pride and responsibility at his words. She understood now that she had been participating in something much larger than a simple shooting challenge. Marcus was conducting what amounted to independent research into the outer limits of human marksmanship capability, research that could potentially reshape military thinking about long-range engagement. "What happens next?" she asked. Marcus secured his rifle in its case before answering. "That depends on what you want to happen next. We could treat this as an interesting experiment and leave it at that. Or we could continue exploring these capabilities, push even further into territory no one has mapped before." Elena looked back toward the target area one more time, still finding it difficult to believe that her bullet had traveled that distance and found its mark. The shot represented a fusion of human skill, technological capability, and mathematical precision that exceeded anything she had previously experienced. "Further how?" she asked. "Longer ranges, more complex environmental conditions, multiple targets, moving targets." Marcus's voice carried the enthusiasm of someone discussing a deeply passionate interest. "The shot you just made proves the basic concept, but there are so many variables we haven't explored." Elena considered the possibilities he was describing. Each additional challenge would require new techniques, new equipment modifications, new mathematical models to predict bullet behavior under increasingly complex conditions. The learning curve would be steep, but the potential rewards were equally significant. "Moving targets at 5,000 meters, she said, thinking through the implications. The lead calculations alone would be incredibly complex. Exactly. We're talking about developing capabilities that don't currently exist in any military doctrine." Marcus finished packing his equipment and shouldered his rifle case. "But we're also talking about a level of secrecy that goes far beyond keeping unauthorized personnel away from condemned buildings." Elena understood the warning implicit in his words. What they were exploring had potential applications that would interest people far above their current pay grades. The kind of research they were conducting could easily attract attention from military leadership, defense contractors, or intelligence agencies. Such attention might provide resources and official support. But it could also result in the research being classified or transferred to other personnel. "How do you want to proceed?" she asked. Marcus started walking back toward their vehicle, moving with the easy confidence of someone who had already made up his mind about something important. "Carefully," he said, "and with complete trust between the two of us. What we're doing works because we're operating outside official channels, using our own time and resources, pursuing objectives that we define ourselves." Elena followed him down the rocky hillside, her mind already moving beyond the shot she had just made toward the challenges Marcus was suggesting. Longer ranges would require even more sophisticated equipment and calculations. Moving targets would add an entirely new dimension of complexity. Environmental conditions that changed during bullet flight time would demand real-time adjustments to aiming solutions. But beneath the technical challenges was something even more compelling. She had just participated in what amounted to a redefinition of what was possible in her chosen field. The shot she had made existed at the intersection of human capability and technological precision, representing a level of achievement that few people would ever experience. "Same time tomorrow?" Marcus asked as they reached the Humvee. Elena smiled, feeling an anticipation she hadn't experienced since her first deployment. "Same time tomorrow." As they drove back toward the base, Elena reflected on how dramatically her understanding of her own capabilities had changed in the span of a single morning. She had always considered herself an exceptional marksman, but the shot she had just made existed in a category beyond anything she had previously imagined. More importantly, she understood now that she had found a partner whose vision of what was possible matched her own ambitions. Marcus wasn't just an accomplished shooter. He was someone willing to invest significant time and resources in exploring the absolute limits of human marksmanship capability. Together, they were positioned to push into territory that no one had systematically explored before. The morning sun was climbing higher as they returned to base, and Elena realized that other soldiers were beginning their daily routines. To them, this would appear to be just another day on deployment. None of them would know that two of their fellow soldiers had just accomplished something that military doctrine considered impossible. Elena found herself looking forward to the secret they now shared, and to the challenges that lay ahead. She had always been driven by the pursuit of perfection in her chosen field. But now she had found a new definition of what perfection might mean. The boundaries she had accepted as absolute had proven to be merely the limits of conventional thinking. As they approached the main gate of the base, Marcus turned to her with the expression that was part accomplishment, part anticipation. "Tomorrow, we start working on 6,000 meters." Elena felt her pulse quicken at the prospect. 6,000 meters would push beyond even the theoretical capabilities of most rifle systems. It would require equipment modifications, new ballistic calculations, and shooting techniques that had never been tested under field conditions. 6,000 meters, she repeated, already beginning to consider the challenges such a distance would present. "The real question," Marcus said as he parked the Humvee, "is whether you're ready to find out just how far this can go." The following morning brought conditions that were far from ideal. A steady wind of 8 to 10 miles per hour was blowing from the northwest, and intermittent clouds cast moving shadows across the landscape between the shooting position and the target area. Elena arrived at the condemned building to find Marcus already there, studying weather data on his tablet with the expression of someone facing a significant tactical problem. "Conditions are marginal," he said without looking up. "Wind is gusting, which makes calculation extremely difficult at extended range. Temperature variance from the shadows is creating thermal layers that will affect bullet trajectory." Elena set down her rifle case and joined him at the window, studying the landscape through her binoculars. The target area was clearly visible, but the vegetation between their position and the distant boulder was moving unpredictably in the shifting wind. More concerning were the cloud shadows that swept across the terrain in irregular patterns, creating temperature differentials that would be impossible to predict accurately. "What's the new target distance?" she asked. 6,200 meters, Marcus replied, gesturing toward a ridgeline that was barely visible even through high-quality optics. "There's a distinctive rock formation on the skyline, roughly 10 feet across. It's a more difficult target than yesterday's boulder, both because of the increased range and because it's positioned against the sky rather than against the hillside." Elena raised her binoculars again, scanning the distant ridgeline until she located the formation Marcus had described. At more than 6 kilometers away, it appeared as little more than a dark speck against the horizon. The fact that it was silhouetted against the sky would make precise aiming more difficult, as there would be no surrounding reference points to help establish the correct holdover. Flight time at that distance? She asked. 7.4 seconds, assuming standard atmospheric conditions, Marcus said. But with current wind patterns, we're looking at potential drift variations that could easily result in a miss measured in yards rather than inches. Elena understood the magnitude of the challenge he was describing. Yesterday's shot had been made under nearly perfect conditions, with stable wind patterns and consistent temperature. Today's attempt would require adapting to constantly changing environmental factors during the bullet's flight time. "Have you attempted this shot before?" she asked. Marcus shook his head. "This is uncharted territory for me as well. The equipment and calculations are all theoretical beyond 5,000 meters. We're going to be learning as we go." They spent the next hour monitoring wind patterns and atmospheric conditions, looking for any period of stability that might offer a window for the shot. Elena found herself studying not just the immediate weather, but the complex interaction between terrain features and air movement that would affect bullet trajectory throughout its long journey. "There," Marcus said suddenly, pointing toward the target area. "Wind indicators are showing a temporary lull. We might have a 5-minute window before the next weather front moves through." Elena quickly began setting up her shooting position, while Marcus prepared his spotting equipment and ballistic calculator. The sense of urgency was different from the previous day's careful, methodical approach. Today they were working against time and changing conditions, making calculations and adjustments on the fly. "Range to target, 6,237 meters, Marcus called out, reading from his laser rangefinder. "Elevation correction, 61.8 minutes of angle. Windage correction for Coriolis effect, 2.4 minutes left." Elena made the elevation adjustment first, cranking the scope turret through more than 100 clicks of adjustment. The required holdover was so extreme that her aim point would be completely off the target, positioned in empty sky far above the distant ridgeline. Only mathematical faith in the ballistic calculations gave her confidence that such an extreme correction could possibly be accurate. "Wind correction is problematic," Marcus continued, studying his weather instruments. "Current wind at this position is 7 miles per hour from the northwest, but I'm seeing different patterns at various points between here and the target. Best estimate is 3.2 minutes right for current conditions, but that could change during flight time." Elena dialed in the windage correction, though she understood that it was based on imperfect information about constantly changing conditions. At this distance, even a small error in wind estimation could result in a miss measured in meters rather than centimeters. "Scope dialed," she announced, settling into her shooting position behind Marcus's custom rifle. Through the powerful telescopic sight, her aim point was positioned far above the visible target, hanging in empty blue sky. The crosshairs seemed to be pointing at nothing at all, an optical illusion that her mind found difficult to accept even though she understood the mathematics involved. "Wind holding temporarily steady," Marcus reported from his spotting position. "Temperature differential from cloud shadows is minimal at the moment. This might be our best opportunity." Elena focused on her breathing rhythm, seeking the state of absolute stillness required for such an extreme shot. The rifle felt familiar in her hands now, though its weight and balance were still noticeably different from her usual Barrett. She had spent the previous evening dry-firing the weapon, learning the precise feel of its trigger and the exact pressure required for a clean break. "Ready when you are," Marcus said quietly. Elena's finger found the trigger, beginning the careful pressure buildup that would culminate in the shot. But as she approached the break point, a gust of wind swept across the target area, visible as movement in the distant vegetation. She released pressure on the trigger and lifted her head from the scope. "Wind shift at the target," she said. "Significant movement in the vegetation on the ridgeline." Marcus checked his instruments and swore softly. "You're right. Wind speed just jumped to 12 miles per hour and shifted to due north. That changes our calculations completely." They waited for the wind to stabilize again, watching the distant landscape for signs of the air movement that would determine the success or failure of their shot. Elena remained in position behind the rifle, but relaxed her grip slightly to avoid inducing muscle fatigue during the extended wait. This is the reality of extreme long-range shooting, Marcus said, as they continued to monitor conditions. At conventional distances, you can adapt to wind changes during the shooting process, but when flight time approaches 8 seconds, you're completely dependent on environmental stability that you can't control. Elena nodded, understanding that they were confronting one of the fundamental challenges that made such shots extraordinarily difficult to execute consistently. The skills and equipment required were only part of the equation. Success also depended on favorable environmental conditions that occurred unpredictably and for limited duration. Wind dropping again, Marcus observed 10 minutes later. Back to 6 miles per hour from the northwest. This might be another window. Elena settled back into her shooting position, re-establishing sight picture through the scope. The aim point remained far above the visible target, an exercise in mathematical trust that still felt counterintuitive despite her successful shot the previous day. New wind calculation, 2.8 minutes right, Marcus reported. Temperature and atmospheric pressure holding steady. Elena made the minor adjustment to her windage setting, then began her breathing sequence again. The world around her faded into the background as she concentrated on achieving perfect stability and timing. Her heartbeat seemed loud in her ears, each pulse creating a tiny movement in the crosshairs that she would need to time correctly. She exhaled slowly, allowing her body to reach its natural point of rest. At the pause between breaths, when her pulse was at its calmest and her muscles were most relaxed, she applied the final pressure to the trigger. The rifle's report was thunderous in the still morning air, and the massive muzzle brake created a spectacular fireball that temporarily obscured her view through the scope. Elena maintained her position behind the weapon, following through on the shot even though she wouldn't be able to observe the results for several seconds. Clean break, good follow-through, Marcus said, though his attention was focused entirely on his spotting scope. Bullet should be approaching the target area. Now, Elena held her breath, waiting for Marcus's assessment of the shot. More than 6 kilometers away, her bullet was completing its long journey through the atmosphere, traveling a path that had taken it hundreds of feet above the intervening terrain before beginning its descent toward the target. Impact, Marcus said suddenly. I see dust and debris at the target area. Elena remained motionless, hardly daring to hope that she had achieved another successful hit at such an extreme distance. The technical challenges involved seemed almost overwhelming in retrospect, from the precise ballistic calculations to the environmental factors that had threatened to change during flight time. Results? She asked, though her voice was barely audible. Marcus was quiet for several seconds, making careful observations through his high-powered spotting scope. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a mixture of amazement and something approaching disbelief. Miss, he said finally. But a very close miss. Impact approximately 2 meters low and 1 meter right of the target. Elena felt a complex mix of disappointment and amazement. While she had failed to achieve a direct hit, the fact that her bullet had impacted within a few meters of a target more than 6 kilometers away seemed almost as remarkable as a direct hit would have been. At such extreme range, even small errors in calculation or execution were magnified dramatically. 2 meters low suggests our elevation calculation was slightly off, Marcus said, reviewing his ballistic data. 1 meter right indicates either a wind estimation error or a slight timing issue with changing conditions during flight time. Elena lifted her head from the scope, blinking in the bright morning sunlight. Despite the technical miss, she felt a deep sense of accomplishment. They had pushed well beyond the boundaries of conventional marksmanship doctrine and come within a few meters of success under challenging conditions. How does that compare to your previous attempts at this distance? She asked. Marcus lowered his spotting scope and turned to face her with an expression of genuine respect. That's the closest I've ever seen anyone come to a successful hit at 6,000 meters. My own best attempt was off by more than 10 meters. Elena began to understand the significance of what they were accomplishing together. Marcus's research had proven that shots at extreme distances were theoretically possible. But Elena's marksmanship ability was allowing them to push closer to practical success than anyone had achieved before. The error margins are becoming more manageable, she observed. Yesterday's shot was successful at 4,800 meters. Today we came very close at 6,200 meters. The techniques are scalable. Marcus nodded enthusiastically. That's exactly the pattern I was hoping to see. We're not just making lucky shots. We're developing reproducible techniques for extreme long-range engagement. Elena looked toward the distant ridgeline where her bullet had impacted, still finding it difficult to comprehend the distances they were working with. 6 kilometers was far enough that the target was barely visible even through powerful optics. Yet they had come within 2 meters of a successful hit. What are the tactical implications of this capability? She asked. Marcus was quiet for a moment, considering the broader significance of what they were developing. A sniper able to engage targets at distances beyond 6 kilometers would be operating from positions that are essentially invulnerable to return fire, he said finally. Traditional counter-sniper tactics become ineffective when the shooter is positioned that far away. Elena thought about the strategic advantages such capability would provide. A sniper operating at ranges beyond 6 kilometers would be positioned far enough away that muzzle flash would be invisible, sound signature would be undetectable, and visual acquisition would be virtually impossible. Even if the general area of the shot was identified, the specific position could be anywhere within a circle, covering dozens of square kilometers. This changes the fundamental equation of battlefield engagement, she realized. Exactly. But it also raises questions about how such capabilities should be developed and deployed. Marcus began packing his equipment, but his movements were slow and thoughtful. What we're doing exists in a gray area between legitimate research and potential security implications. Elena understood what he was suggesting. Their research had advanced to the point where it might interest people far above their current level in the military hierarchy. The kind of capabilities they were developing could have applications in special operations, intelligence gathering, or strategic deterrence that would attract attention from classified programs. Are you suggesting we need to be more careful about who knows what we're doing? She asked. Marcus secured his rifle in its case before answering. I'm suggesting we need to decide whether we want to continue this as independent research, or whether we're ready to present our findings to people who might want to formalize what we're doing. Elena considered the implications of both options. Keeping their research unofficial would allow them to continue exploring these capabilities without outside interference, but it would also limit their access to resources and advanced equipment. Bringing their work to official attention might provide significant support, but it could also result in the research being classified or transferred to other personnel. What do you think we should do? She asked. Marcus was quiet for several minutes, studying the distant landscape where they had just demonstrated capabilities that didn't officially exist. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone who had been thinking about this decision for a long time. I think we should continue pushing the boundaries until we understand exactly what's possible, he said finally. Once we know the absolute limits of these techniques, then we can decide how to share that knowledge responsibly. Elena found herself nodding in agreement. They had stumbled onto something that could fundamentally change military doctrine about long-range engagement, but they needed to understand it completely before exposing it to outside scrutiny. How much further can we realistically expect to push these distances? She asked. Marcus smiled, but there was a serious edge to his expression. With the right equipment modifications and perfect conditions, I think we might be able to achieve successful hits at distances approaching 8 kilometers. Beyond that, we start running into fundamental physical limitations that no amount of skill or technology can overcome. 8 kilometers. Elena tried to imagine the challenges such a distance would present. Flight time would approach 10 seconds, during which atmospheric conditions could change dramatically. Bullet drop would be measured in hundreds of feet, requiring holdovers so extreme that the target would be completely outside the field of view of any conventional rifle scope. 8 kilometers would require equipment modifications that we can't accomplish with standard military resources, she observed. Exactly. Which brings us back to the question of whether we want to continue this as independent research or whether we're ready to seek official support. Marcus shouldered his rifle case and began walking toward their vehicle. Either way, we're approaching decisions that will determine not just how far we can push these capabilities, but how those capabilities might eventually be used. Elena followed him down the rocky hillside, her mind already working on the technical challenges that even longer ranges would present. But beneath the mathematical problems was a growing awareness that she was participating in research that could have profound implications for the future of warfare. "Same time tomorrow?" Marcus asked as they reached the Humvee. Elena looked back toward the distant ridgeline where her bullet had impacted, knowing that each successful shot was pushing them closer to capabilities that would inevitably attract attention from beyond their small community of two. "Same time tomorrow," she agreed, understanding that they were approaching a threshold where their independent research would need to evolve into something larger and more formal. But for now, she was content to continue exploring the outer boundaries of what was possible when human skill met advanced technology and mathematical precision. Each shot was teaching them something new about the physics of extreme long-range ballistics, and each day brought them closer to understanding exactly how far these techniques could be pushed. The morning sun was climbing higher as they drove back toward the base, and Elena realized that she was already anticipating tomorrow's challenge. Somewhere in the mountains surrounding their position was a target that would test the absolute limits of their equipment and abilities. Finding it and hitting it would require everything they had learned about the intersection of marksmanship, technology, and environmental science. Elena had always been driven by the pursuit of perfection in her chosen field. But now she understood that perfection itself was a moving target. Each successful shot redefined what was possible, pushing the boundaries of achievement into territory that no one had systematically explored before. As they approached the main gate of the base, she reflected on how dramatically her understanding of her own capabilities had evolved over just 2 days. She had always considered herself an exceptional marksman, but now she knew that exceptional was itself a limitation that could be transcended with the right approach, the right equipment, and the right partnership. The future stretched ahead of them with challenges that would test every aspect of their skills and knowledge. But Elena found herself looking forward to those challenges with an anticipation she hadn't experienced since her earliest days of military training, when everything had seemed possible and every day brought new discoveries about what she was capable of achieving. Tomorrow would bring new targets, new distances, and new problems to solve. And somewhere beyond tomorrow lay the absolute limits of human marksmanship capability, waiting to be discovered by two soldiers who had decided that impossible was just another word for unexplored.